So welcome everyone to this University of Wolverhampton webinar on motivational interviewing. I'm just going to leave it for 30 seconds and to allow people to get into the webinar, and then we'll start straight away. All right, thank you everyone for coming to this webinar. So I just want to begin with some basic housekeeping. So welcome to the event. Just to make everyone aware, you probably are aware, but just to be clear that the event is being recorded. There will be an opportunity after Professor Forrester has spoken and has done a brief initial presentation for people to ask questions. If people could add their questions to the question and answer box rather than into the chat, that'd be really helpful. It makes it a little bit easier to pick out the questions that are aimed directly at the speaker, and allows the chat to be used for people to talk amongst yourselves. As I say, if you're using the chat function, or we will use the chat function as ourselves to give you links to different things that might be of interest, and obviously you yourselves are able to use the chat to talk amongst yourselves. We won't be taking live questions, and therefore we won't be using the raised hand function in Zoom. So today's webinar is on motivational interviewing with children and families, and we're really pleased to have Professor Donald Forrester from Cardiff University. Donald's main interest is in around work with children and families, and particularly the relationship between good practice and outcomes, and understanding what it is about organisations that enables good practice. So Donald is, many of you will know Donald already, but he's very prominent in social work academia and has done lots of, been at the forefront of lots of important projects. He set up the Tilda Goldberg Centre, is the lead academic for Frontline and the founder of the What Works Centre, and leading Cascade, the Centre for Children's Social Care Research and Development. Donald has published extensively around children and families social work since 2006, and today's webinar is around Donald's publications with David Wilkins and Charlotte Whitaker, and is on his book Motivational Interviewing for Working with Children and Families. So motivational interviewing is widely used in children and family, in adults' work, but has been less used in children's. But I think is really becoming quite popular with local authorities because of the strengths-based approach that it takes and draws from. So Donald's book is a welcome and timely arrival, I think. I will put a link to Donald's book into the chat for those of you who are interested in getting hold of a copy. And you can follow Donald on Twitter, and his Twitter handle is @Donald FORR. So just the first bit of his surname. Where you can follow Donald, and he does tweet out lots of stuff that he's doing and other webinars that he's doing and links to research that he's been involved in, so that's really helpful. So the webinar, I will hand over now to Donald, who will do a presentation, and then there will be an opportunity to ask questions. So thank you for coming, Donald. Welcome to the University of Wolverhampton Social Work webinar, and I'll hand over to you. Thank you.
Well, thank you for the introduction. My pleasure. I'm looking forward to talking probably quite a bit, and also I hope if people have questions, there'll be time to answer some of those questions. So do pop any questions you have into the chat as we go along. I'm going to share my screen. I've got too many slides, really, but hopefully we'll have time to get through them all. I guess it's worth just giving a little bit of background. So I was a social worker for 8 or 9 years in London, and I really came into academic life to answer questions about practice. And in my first study, I really found a lot of social workers were having the same, and this is 20 years ago, were having similar problems to me. How do you work with families that will engage them? How do you have difficult conversations? What does the evidence say? And there wasn't much evidence out there. And I was particularly interested in parental substance misuse. So I thought, what works in relation to working with people who've got drug or alcohol problems? And motivational interviewing is one of the key things that sort of works with that group, and is particularly good at working with where there's resistance or conflict. So I thought that was quite a good fit for child and family social work. So I've been involved in quite a lot of studies and evaluations since then, and I'm kind of and have just is this working? Just published a book, which I'd be delighted if you bought, but if not, well, buy another book instead. No, I shouldn't be saying that, should I? So in this book, we try to sort of bring together some of our thinking, not just about what motivational interviewing is, the first sort of third is that, but really then how would you apply it to child and family social work? And I guess one of the USP, the unique selling point of the book, is that it involves a lot of recordings of actual practice. So actually what social workers said and what parents said, rather than in theory what they might have said, some of which I'll put into this talk. Thinking about what we'll cover today, I'm going to try to introduce some key concepts and skills in motivational interviewing and try to apply these to the sort of difficult conversations we have in child and family work. And that, I don't know how much time we'll have to think about it, but that kind of relates to what is the point of social work or child and family social work, because MI is a counselling method, social work is not counselling. We're increasingly thinking about how to bring in things that are counselling into social work, but given that it's not counselling, what is it and how can we adapt these things to make them useful for social work? But I really want to emphasise one thing at the beginning, which is this 1 hour will not make you skilled in motivational interviewing. In fact, there is a risk that it will make you worse, which I always worry about, because a 1 or 2 hour session or even a one-day workshop has been shown to increase people's self-assessment of how good they are, but not actually change their practice. So Bill Miller, one of the creators of MI, says he worries that it's a bit like vaccinating people, which we're all very familiar with at the moment. You give people a little bit of something, and that makes them immune from actually in this case, the hard work of actually learning MI. So this is just a taster or perhaps a reminder for you of what's involved in MI. You will not and cannot become skilled in MI from this session, but you can decide whether or not you're interested in it and what steps you might take next to become better at MI. So that's odd, it's got off the screen, isn't it? So how do social workers talk to people and how should they talk to people? I'm going to give some examples from one of my early studies from almost 20 years ago of prompts we gave to social workers. Normally this would be quite interactive, but I'm just going to have to ask you to imagine how you would respond. So a 23-year-old father telephones you to say, I'm not going to be able to keep my appointment at the Child Protection Conference tomorrow. We just learned that my dad has cancer. If you just take a moment to think about how would you respond to that if that was your phone call? And then I'll give you a fairly typical response we got from a social worker. The conference is important for you to attend. Unfortunately, we can't postpone it. If you can make it to the conference, it would be greatly appreciated. I hope things work out for your father. I'm kind of hoping there's a difference between what you're seeing there and what you thought you would respond. But it's important to ask why social workers were giving this type of response. Similarly, with the next one, a 32-year-old woman says, last night Joe came home drunk again and kicked in the TV set while the kids were still watching it, and then he knocked me down. He scared us all half to death. How might you respond to that? What would be a good response to that? Here's a fairly typical one we got from social workers 20 years ago. Things may have changed. What did you do with the children? Did you call the police? What is striking about both these responses is that they're not high on empathy. They're much more focused on really risk and authority. And I guess it's important that begins to emphasize the fact that what we're talking about here in social work particularly in child protection where my work happens, is it's not counselling, it's something else. So why would social workers be thinking these are sort of the sorts of response they should give? We also developed a prompt in an interview that was based on a family I visited. You're on duty to do assessments. A referral is received from a mother who often picks up her 8-year-old child when she seems drunk. You visit and explain the nature of the referral to the mother. If the mother said to you, that's not true, I'm on antidepressants and they make me appear drunk, what do you think you would say next? So have a think about what you would say next, and I'll give you a couple of fairly common responses from social workers. This is contradictory to what the school is saying. The school feel you've presented drunk, and this is why we've got the referral and we're concerned. If you're saying it's the antidepressants, you need to go back to your GP and adjust the doses. It's clearly a problem. Or, can I see the bottle of antidepressants? Where does it say that on the label? So, I think these are kind of problematic types of responses. Let's take the last one. Once you say that to a person, you're not really leaving them any room, anywhere to go. I think it's very likely to blow up. On the other hand, if you took a sort of counselling approach and just said, oh, that must be very difficult for you, and you did that throughout the whole interview, you wouldn't really be carrying out a child protection function. So I think what's important to understand is we got responses like this so often, and we still do, that they underline the fact that in the broad context of children's services and potential child protection issues, there's an authority responsibility to provide challenge and to assess what the actual risks are to a child. And that's what results in comments like these. However, the problem is they often create problems in relationships and conflict and resistance from the people we're working with. So I guess the question is, could we do those difficult things, have those difficult conversations in a more constructive way? So it's worth sort of stepping back and thinking, well, what are social workers doing here, and what do they tend to do? We've recorded over 800 meetings between social workers and parents, or mostly parents, some are with actors playing parents. And the most common sort of way social workers try to create change is to try to persuade or advise or sometimes confront people about things. And there's two problems. Well, there's multiple problems with this. One is it tends not to work. People tend not to change when you try to persuade them what to do. That's even more true in the sort of relationship a social worker is likely to have with a parent. So if you try to persuade your partner to stop smoking, they may listen to you. But if a social worker comes and does it, they're very unlikely to. And it tends to increase resistance. So I think resistance of all sorts from parents is ubiquitous in children's services. And we have to ask ourselves, some of that is created by the context, but how much are we perhaps contributing to that? And then crucially, what might work better? If this persuasion advising approach doesn't work terribly well the way we're doing it now, how might we do it better? And that's where I think NMI comes in. So I'm going to introduce some of the kind of key thoughts and ideas in NMI. The first one is that we can increase or reduce resistance by the way we talk to people. This is better learnt experientially, but you can sort of see in some of those, I hope, responses that they would be likely to create resistance. And yeah, evidence shows that the more resistance you create, the less change is likely. So that's a sort of starting point for how can we begin to have better conversations with people? How might we reduce resistance and engage people better? And the first set of skills are not, they're certainly part of MI, but they're not at all unique to motivational interviewing. They're really part of just generally good listening, because good listening reduces resistance. So that's good body language, attunement to the person, open questions that show you've related to what they've said before. MI places a heavy emphasis on reflections, which is a way of summarizing back to people what you think they're feeling, thinking, or saying. And that's really important because you're not just assuming you understand them, you're trying to show them your understanding, and people find it really helpful to hear back what they are or not saying. It also allows them the opportunity to challenge it. So I think it's a sort of deeply anti-discriminatory way of working with people. And those are undergirded by values of being respectful and caring for people. But MI is more than just good listening. Good listening is a starting point, but it's not an end point for what we're talking about here. So firstly, if you do just listen to people, sometimes that can be all they need, but sometimes the conversation could start just going around in a circle. Secondly, I think there's a problem in social work that we come with an agenda provided by the agency. So there is a referral or a concern or something going on. So just listening, I don't think is really something that is very often an option for social workers. So how can we avoid going around in circles and have more constructive conversations where we listen but don't just listen? And I think ideas from MI are really helpful in this regard. So MI has a basic theory of change. And at the simplest, it is this. If you imagine people's motivation as a spectrum, and at one end, you have people who don't think they've got a problem, they don't want to change. It does not matter how you talk to people like that, they're probably not going to change. At the other end, you have people who think they do have a problem, they want to do something about it, they're ready to go. Actually, those people will very often, well, they're a joy to work with, but they often sort out problems very quickly or all by themselves. For most helping professions, not just MI, but alcohol counselors and nurses and all sorts of people working with behavior change, it's people in the middle who are ambivalent, who are in two minds about change. They may see that there's a problem, but they find it hard to imagine they could quit, or they enjoy certain aspects of smoking, drinking, eating, whatever it is, they also think it's causing them a problem. It's that ambivalence that is typically the place where we do the most work. At the simplest, motivation, our sense of motivation as individuals, is the difference between the life we're leading and the life we would like to lead, or between our current behavior and the behavior we would like to have. So I would like to never, ever, ever shout at my son. Sometimes I do. The gap is the thing I would like to work on, and others will have other areas. We all have areas we'd like to, well, most of us, I assume, have areas we'd like to improve on in our lives. And often this can be down to really almost fundamental values, like what sort of person do you want to be? What sort of life do you want to be? What sort of parent do you want to be? So it can take you down to your core values and your current behavior, whether the two are a good fit for each other or whether it's a gap. That gap, exploring that gap, using it as the basis for building motivation is kind of central part of MI, because MI tries to focus on that gap and see whether there is a gap, and where there is a gap, try to help people explore it and see whether it's enough for them to begin to make a change. So this is like all of motivational interviewing on one slide. I'm just going to go through this in 2 minutes to give an indication, but obviously, if you're new to MI, it'll just be a beginning to sort of get a sense of how it all hangs together. It kind of starts at the bottom. So the foundations are the principles and values, which should be being client-centered, being respectful. The so-called spirit of MI, which is that it's about increasing autonomy, work, that is the person's sense of having control over the decisions in their lives and responsibility for the decisions in their lives, and evoking from them their own motivation rather than giving them things. So rather than telling them smoking is bad, you're trying to get them to explore the ways in which smoking may be bad for them. And then the top level is, of the foundations are the basic skills, which are often called OARs, the open questions, affirmations, which are recognizing and feeding back the positives, reflections, and then more complicated reflections, which are summaries. And the kind of theoretical construct, or a part of the theoretical construct, is this notion of ambivalence. And that the idea is, by the questions you ask and the things you say, you can increase resistance, which can be thought of as discord or talk that sustains the problem. And the more you do that, the more likely you are to create no change. Or you can get people to talk about change, which is their motivations for change or actions they may take, which increases change. So as a helper and as a social worker, you're strategically steering the conversation towards more change talk. Another way of thinking about this is in 4 stages of NMI conversation, which are engage, focus, evoke, plan, and action. So the engage section is really where, so good listening skills are part of all of it, but the engage section is almost just big good listening skills. And the reason I put that shape in there is it sort of opens out the conversation. People will talk more and more, you will get to understand more what's going on. But if you just do that, things can just become a bit amorphous, a bit shapeless. You need to find a focus for the work, and that's where using skills like summary statements and agenda setting to help people focus on what they want to work on provides more clarity. So that the shape there is to try to bring the conversation into focus. Once you then have your topic or your issue, again, you're evoking from people their motivations, their own ideas for what they might do, providing reflections to them. And again, that may open out the conversation. And then the final bit is to move that, and this is the crucial bit, which many people don't seem to get about MI, is you then need to move toward a plan and action. So the session should be ending with a collaborative sense of what the plan and action is. And in counselling, that tends to be the person deciding what actions they want to take. In social work, it could be a more collaborative thing with them having some actions and perhaps you as a social worker having some actions that you want to take. So that's a kind of high-level overview. And one of the things about that is there are the skills, but there's also the strategic overview management of the interview. And crucial to that is having the skills to open up the conversation, but also to help the conversation find focus and deciding at any time, are we opening the conversation now, or are we sort of finding a focus and being able to move from one to the other, which is about strategic use of open questions, reflections will open a conversation, certain types of summary statement and more closed questions will close it. So you need to be using them appropriately to create a collaborative conversation. So just a very quick overview of the evidence base. There's a very, very large evidence base around motivational interviewing, much more so than most types of interventions that we talk about in social work. So there are hundreds of randomized controlled trials, which are sort of robust tests of whether something works or not. And I'm not aware of any where MI has not been at least as good as the comparison. There are quite a lot where it's better. So it tends to work as well as alternatives, and it's often somewhat better. And it often works sort of more quickly or in briefer interventions. So I'd say sort of MI is the sort of standard starting point now for working with substance misuse issues. You may need more than MI, but you probably start with MI. It's also often used in combination with other approaches like cognitive behavioral therapy or others which allow or help deeper work. But the MI is particularly helpful for the engagement element. And actually throughout, and engagement isn't just something that happens at the beginning. Engagement is something that happens all the way through a helping relationship. You're constantly keeping people engaged, and MI skills help with that. So that's kind of the general theory of MI, very quickly at a very high level, and a little bit about the research evidence. I'm really conscious, if I was there, I would stop and you could all ask questions and we could have a discussion. And I'm just going to have to plow on. But if you do have questions, pop them in the box and we'll try to get to them. But I'd now like to sort of look at our work around MI and child protection conversations and whether we could adapt some of the ideas to have difficult, and in fact, I'm going to look at a very difficult child protection conversation. And to do that, I'm going to think about what does MI say about raising concerns. So a lot of what I've talked about so far, a lot of what other people talk about in relation to MI is the listening type skills. But actually, MI also says you have to raise concerns sometimes. To be genuine and have an honest relationship with somebody, you need to be able to tell them about some concerns. Now, they do that in a counselling setting, but let's learn from what they do and then think about applying that into social work. Similarly with giving advice, a lot of MI work has been around health settings, how you give advice in a way that will maximize people's likelihood of work, taking it up. What can we learn from that? Which then I think can help us thinking about conversations in child protection, where I think a key concept is the idea of purposeful dialogue. So we're not counselling. What are we doing? We're having a dialogue, a two-way conversation. How can the skills of MI facilitate a two-way conversation where the purpose is to try to ensure a child is safer or having their needs better met than they currently are? And I think we perhaps haven't theorized this enough in social work, and we need to be doing more at the detail level, I guess. So thinking about those three things, let's start with raising concerns. Have a think about how you would respond to this, which it's an upsetting quote, but I have to say it's partly based on a family I worked with. This is a real sort of thing people might deal with. So this is a woman who says, last night he beat me and stubbed out his cigarette on me. Last time I came to see you, he strangled me until I lost consciousness. This morning, he said, if I came to see you this afternoon, he'd kill me. I'm sure he knows I'm here, but I'm scared if I don't go back, he will find me and kill me. So what's the point? I might as well just go back. Have a think about, if you were a social worker talking to someone and they said that to you, how would you respond? And what might be a helpful way to respond, and what would be the key elements of a helpful way to respond? Again, it would be so much better to do this interaction, but I'll move through a couple of examples of ways people might respond to get us thinking about it. So I think, my gut says this. That's terrible. You have to leave him. Going back is much too dangerous. You wait here. I'll go and phone some refugees and find you somewhere else to stay. I think emotionally, many of us will feel that because it's a very extreme example. What are the problems with that as a response? Well, you have a think about the problems with that as a response. I think it may be taking away agency, the sense that they can make decisions from people. And that sort of response may be contributing to what can often be a frustrating experience of, obviously, this woman should leave this man. Why is she not doing it? Or a different response. You're really scared for your life right now. That would be a kind of non-directive listening response. I think both of those are problematic. The first is really about your emotions, and it's not about giving the person recognition of what they're going through or what decisions they might make. The other is leaving your own strong sense that it's too dangerous for this woman to go back, sort of completely out of it because you're trying to be non-directive. And I think there's a middle way, which I think MI as a directive method helps us think about. And something like this, I think, might be useful or better. But I really, really wish I could talk to you all about what you think about it. Anyway, what you've just told me is horrific. Nobody should be treated like that. What you decide to do is your choice, and I can see you feel pretty hopeless right now. I have to tell you what I think. I think you've come to the end of the road here. If you go home tonight, I think he may kill you. And if not tonight, then another night. I also want to tell you I've worked with other women in situations like yours, women who thought they could not escape. They managed to rebuild their lives. I know that is a hard thing to do, but what I think you're really telling me is that you know you need to leave him, but you're understandably scared. I would like you to help you get away safely. What do you want to do? I mean, it's obviously a much longer response, but I think here we're trying to not let our emotions override it, but nonetheless be clear what we think, trying to show we understand the woman's situation, or this is our understanding of her situation, and then recognizing that these are decisions that she needs to make. So I think this may be a more helpful way of raising concerns if we are concerned about something that is happening. So these are three things I've mentioned. So key elements of raising concern in MI, and I think generally, are we need to demonstrate an understanding of the person's point of view. We need to be genuine, including being genuinely concerned and telling people. But we need to emphasize their decisions, because ultimately it is the person's decision. So we'll come back to this in the context of child protection later on. So I think this is a helpful sort of starting point for moving beyond MI as just counselling towards thinking about, well, how would you raise concerns in a way that is more likely to be helpful, more likely to be taken on and lead to a helpful conversation, we hope. And I want to, it has a lot of similarities to what we do in relation to giving advice. So MI is a counselling method, but it's often used by people who want to give advice, but have long experience that giving advice actually isn't a very good way of getting people to change behaviour. So how can we make it a better way? So MI has thought a lot about how to do that. Key elements are demonstrating an understanding of the person's point of view, trying to create a dialogue about the issue. So it's not just, here's what you should do. Why don't you go away and do it? You know, eat less and exercise more, you'll lose weight. Off you go. How can we create a dialogue? Because dialogue is much more likely to lead to change. And we need to recognize that ultimately it's up to people to make decisions over their lives. So in MI, the framework used to capture that is EPE, elicit, provide, elicit. And I think this is really just about trying to make sure that advice giving or concern raising is not just dumping on the person, but trying to create a dialogue. So the first E is eliciting from the person their understanding of the situation or the problem, so that you're not just providing a solution or advice or concern out of the blue. Then you're providing, if helpful, advice, and I think also concerns, and eliciting from people their response to your advice is the third thing. So you don't just provide advice, you ask people what they think of that, what are the strengths and weaknesses, is it something they could work with? And by doing that, you're trying to make advice giving into a dialogue, not a one-off event. Which then takes us to what we might use from that idea in child and family social work. And I think for me, it's about this concept of trying to create a dialogue. Because I don't really have time to go into this in great depth, but I'd be very happy to pick it up if people have got questions and we have time at the end. But social work is not counselling. It occupies, I think, that awkward space between society and the individuals. The society provides laws about abuse and what's acceptable. The individual has their own views. We tend to want to give people a lot of freedom, but we are balancing the rights of the child to protection, the rights of the family to family life, etc. How can we take principles of MI, which is a counselling approach, into this kind of more complicated type of conversation? And I think the key here is, for me, is the idea of a purposeful dialogue, trying to create a dialogue, a genuine two-way conversation, more two-way than counselling would be, because you're representing the state and society and the legitimate concerns that we may have. But you're not just sort of dumping that in a one-way monologue. You're trying to create a dialogue about what the issues are. And so I think it's essentially the same framework as the advice giving one, the elicit, provide, elicit. So you try to get from people their understanding of the situation, you provide your concern in a clear and concrete way, and then you try to elicit from them their response to that. And that's a continual cycle in which you're going backwards and forwards to have a dialogue about what the issue is in an attempt to resolve it, with the purpose being to improve the well-being and safety of children. So I now want to sort of take this in the time I've got left, which, because I've gone reasonably fast, is not too bad actually, so there may be some opportunities for questions, but I want to take it really to the hardest place I possibly can. So in workshops and teaching, we use this case study, which we also discuss in one of the chapters of the book, which is based loosely on the Jasmine Beckford case where Jasmine Beckford died. And so it's really very serious level of concerns. I won't give you the whole detail, but we are talking about a child called Esme, age 6. There's a history of very serious concerns. The neighbor says the child is screaming as if in severe pain throughout the night. The setup is, this stuff has happened before. The parents said they would go to the doctor, they didn't, so nobody saw the child. This time, you absolutely have to see the child. You know, the manager says you cannot leave that room without seeing the child. How would you manage such an encounter ethically and effectively? What are the things you would be bringing to that conversation? How would you have that really difficult conversation? And I guess a key thing for me is, at this point, do we throw all the nice counselling stuff out? And I get a sense that quite often happens, that you know, we teach all the social work students all this non-directive, open questions, empathy, etc. But when you've got to tell someone that, you know, you're really, really concerned about their child, and if they don't let you see them, you know, X, Y, Z will happen. I think some people feel, well, counselling doesn't cover this, so I'm going to have to make up stuff, or the agency develops ways of doing it. What I would like to think is, how can we combine that sort of counselling stuff with appropriate good use of authority? So we'll go through this made up kind of case study, and it's made up, and this is a crucial point, it doesn't matter how well you use MI skills, nothing will change it. So this really difficult situation, how could you use some of the skills and principles I've talked about to have a conversation? So let's imagine you do go around, you explain the concern, and the parents respond by explaining the screams. As Esme being very ill last night, she couldn't get to sleep, she had terrible stomach pains and a temperature. They gave her quite a lot of Calpol. Now, last she's now asleep, and they're not going to let you, the social worker, see her or wake her up. And this is what happened with was a combination of Jasmine Beckford and Kimberly Carlisle cases. This is what happened, and what actually happened is the social work manager agreed to stand on a chair and look through a window at the child, not talk to them. We're going to say we have to see this child. How would you respond there? What would be your conversational response to this? What is a good way of responding to this? Really, I mean, this is kind of as difficult as it gets, and it's deliberately designed to be as difficult as it gets. I think, having run this workshop a lot, particularly with experienced workers, we also now do it with students, I think workers quite understandably will sort of up the ante. So sometimes with a bit of persuasion put in. So they'll try to sugarcoat what they're going to say, but they basically say, I've got to see her. So a typical thing that an experienced social worker might say is, so you're telling me she's ill, but I need to see her anyway. I'll be as quick as I can. I'll try not to disturb her too much, but I do need to see her. I suppose what I'm interested in is how could we take the skills of MI to try to create a dialogue about what's going on, and also maximize the sense that the parents in this case have got decisions to make and need to be clear about what those decisions are. So I think the skills of MI are really important here. We try to demonstrate an understanding of the point of view of the parents, the POV, through questions, reflections, and then the summary statement. The summary statement is one of the key things for bringing a conversation into a more focused stage. So there is no right answer here, but this is just one I sort of wrote up. So you're fed up, we're here asking to see Esme. You've had a terrible night, Esme has just got to sleep, and the last thing you want is for us to go in and wake her up. You feel we're always coming around, poking our noses in and making things worse. There's no way you're going to let us wake up Esme now. Is that a fair summary of how you're feeling? Now, the point of this is to A, to actually listen to the person, and B, to show them you've listened and understood what they're saying. Now, the conversation will probably go on quite a lot, but once you have sort of shown an understanding of their point of view, you do need to explain clearly your concerns. So an example might be the dad says, yeah, it's just one thing after another with you lot. I mean, if your kid was asleep and sick, you wouldn't let some social worker wake them up, would you? The most important thing for you is that Esme gets some sleep and is not disturbed. I can see why you feel like that. For me, there are some other things I'm worried about. I'm here because a neighbor called and said she had lots of screaming and it sounded like a child was in pain. Normally in a situation like this, we might talk about coming around later and taking Esme to the doctor, but a couple of times before when we agreed that with you, it didn't happen. So I need to see Esme this morning to make sure she's safe as well. In my experience as a social worker, I imagine there'd then be a great big discussion about whether or not they did take them to the doctor before, or all sorts of stuff would happen. So I'm just taking excerpts from an imagined conversation here, and you'd have to listen to those things. But at some point, I guess, because we've designed, what happens is actually when we run the role play, and often I do it in front of people, but I just don't think I could do that on a video call. The people playing the parents just feel, well, if Esme was not really injured, we would have let you see her. Because I think if you really listen to people and show that you've understood their point of view and then explain your point of view, you tend to get to a position where people, the vast majority of people, will go along with that. However, in this scenario, we've set it up that it doesn't matter how reasonable you are, it doesn't matter how much you show their understanding, it doesn't matter how respectful you are. Because Esme has been very seriously injured, they will not let you into that room. So now we get to the sort of almost the hardest thing you can do in social work. How do you then say, but I need to get into that room? And in my experience, very often, that is exactly what social workers say. They say, but I need to get into the room, I have to get into that room. So how can we say that in a way that is sort of consistent with motivational interviewing? Before I give you an example of how I might approach it, have a think how you would approach it. What would you say? What would be your response? What do you think a good response would be? And feel free to pick holes in my response. I think I would be trying to explain the options, limited though they are, and the consequences, because ultimately the parents have got a decision to make about where they want to go with this. I try to treat the parent with respect throughout and demonstrate an understanding of their perspective. And let them decide what happens next, even though their options may be limited, because I have few options. I have to see Esme. So a response might be something like this. From my point of view, I still have this call we received, and the only way I can really find out whether Esme, oh my gosh, what happened there? Sorry. I lost it. I don't know if you lost the picture there. Can people still see it?
Yes, I can, Donald.
Good. One person's enough. That's good. Good. So I might respond like this. From my point of view, I still have this call we received, and the only way I can really find out whether Esme is okay is to see her and talk with her. We talked for a while, and I think I need to explain what your options are now. As I said, I have to see Esme this morning. What I hope is that you will have a think about it and let me see her, but you do not have to do that. If I do leave without seeing her, I'm so worried that I will call the police and have to come back with them. They've got the legal right to make sure we can see Esme. Well, obviously, that's the last thing I want to do. But if you don't feel you can let me see her now, you need to know what will happen next. So which option do you want to go for? I'd really be interested to see what other people think and how you might respond in this situation, and what you think of that response. I mean, my guess is the parents will get very angry and throw you out. I don't think motivational interviewing or anything is or even should be a magic wand that bends people to your will. There is no such thing, and thank goodness there isn't, because I wouldn't want a magic wand bending me to people's will. It's just a way of sort of maximizing the chances that for any reasonable person you will get to a reasonable sort of conclusion in the discussion. I think it provides the skills and values that allow us to try to create and promote dialogue, not just with the easy conversations, but also, and even more importantly, with the really difficult conversations. So these principles of trying to understand the other person's point of view, trying to demonstrate your understanding, being able to open up and then close down the conversation, trying to maximize people's sense that they have decisions to make over their own life and can take control of their own life. I think they provide the foundation for good practice and for ethical practice. One of the interesting features of motivational interviewing is it works particularly well compared to other approaches with Black and other minority groups. And I think that's because so often normal practice is non-respectful and doesn't take seriously people's views of their own lives. And MI puts that absolutely at the heart of how it works with people. So my primary interest really is that it's an ethical approach, but also it tends to be more effective. It tends to be more effective than being very confrontational with people, telling them what to do, persuading them or advising them. So I'm quite a big fan, but it's not perfect by any means. So I just want to finish off with a few general points, and then I think there'll be a few minutes for questions, or I can look at the questions that have come up. I think there's 3 now. The principles are more important than the techniques. So treating people with respect and having decisions to make about their own life, their own behavior, those are central principles, supported by practices and concepts like ambivalence and motivation, the concept of resistance and change talk and how we can increase or reduce them, and focusing on a guiding way of having a conversation and developing dialogue. And then the technical skills, the ORs, the open questions, the affirmations, the reflections, the summary statements, and the more general sort of how you manage an interview are servants really to these ideas and principles. So in fact, that's the end, and I will try to go to some of the questions people have got. So I'd be interested in any other questions people want to put up. I'd be interested in thinking about how you can become better. And I really hope I haven't vaccinated you. What my intention in this is not to give you a sense that you now know MI. I wanted to give people enough of a sense that this might be a useful framework for thinking about how to have conversations with people, and that you might want to take it further. So with that, I'll stop. Well, I'll stop the presentation. Should I Shall
Yeah,
I look at the questions
I
now?
think that was, yeah, no, I think that was really, really helpful, actually, Donald. And it must be said, is I'm generally a little bit of a skeptic on models, but actually, I think I'm a bit of a skeptic for reasons that you actually talked about, which is, I think, really, really interesting, and actually that are contained within the book, which is, I think sometimes we get overconfident on models, and actually what the models like motivational interviewing offer is actually, it's about how you do it, not necessarily what you do. And I think your example around your sort of case study, the sort of Jasmine Beckford, Kimberly Carlisle case is Maria Colwell sort of Kimberly Carlisle is a really good example, actually, that the model won't solve, models don't solve problems, but actually it's how we utilize the techniques and skills that those models sort of put to us that actually is where the practice happens.
Yeah, no, I agree. And to some extent now, because I've evaluated things like restorative approaches and systemic practice and motivational interviewing and trauma-informed more recently, really, they have a lot of similarities. They have more similarities than differences. In some ways, I don't think it matters which one you choose. What's more important is trying to become really good at working with people, and they each provide a framework for thinking about that. So it's a bit like, do you prefer saxophone, piano, or guitar? Maybe it doesn't matter. What matters is pick one and become good at it, and then you can play music. So it's a bit like that.
Yeah. Do you want to go to the questions?
Yes, sure.
Yeah.
I'm going to read the shortest question first, which is the one of when you only have short-term involvement with the child parent, such as at the front door of the service or a first assessment, what would be tips on using MI? So I'd say a couple of things about MI. MI is shown to be particularly effective in short, brief interventions. And the second thing is in our research, so a lot of people say, a lot of workers, when we've trained people in MI, say, I don't have time for this. I just have to go and tell people stuff. I do not have time. Interviews where people use MI skills compared to interviews where they don't are shorter. That's just empirically true from our studies. And the reason is, where people don't use MI skills, they're much more likely to get into pointless arguments or discussions, or there's a lot of wasted sort of friction. Whereas people who are really good at MI are still able to control a conversation, but able to do it relatively briefly. So I think you can use the principles of MI in very brief interventions. I think you can also use them as part of assessment, which is well, probably beyond the reach of this seminar, but yes, so I think it's compatible with that. So the first question was, really interesting session, good, enjoyed it very much. Probation officer, oh, she has to leave. Oh, I don't think that's a question. Have you researched the use of tech? Sorry. MI and domestic violence, right. Yeah, we have done a lot of that, and we are doing a lot of that. In relation to child and family social work, I can think of no area that using something like MI is more important than in domestic abuse, because where it's not used, a lot of the practice, I have to say, is social workers telling women what they should do to protect children from abusive men. And we need to get into a much more collaborative way of working with women who are, by and large, themselves victims of violence, and understanding their situation and the limited options they may have. But this is also a crucial point, which perhaps ties back to the point you were making earlier. So you also, there's a higher level than the skills of working with people, which is about who you work with and why you work with them. So you could, in theory, have a very motivational interviewing conversation with someone about how she should protect the children from a violent man. But at a higher level, we need to be questioning whether it is the woman we should be having the conversation with, or, as is usually the case, the man who is the abuser. So, we need the wisdom to be working with the right people on the right issues. And MI is essentially neutral about that, though its collaborative nature makes it less likely. But I still, social work can't be reduced to motivational interviewing. We still need to be making wise decisions about the right ways and the right issues we're working with people on. Yes, so Lucy Porches asked a really good question. I think one of the issues we witnessed in practice and in some research is about social workers wanting to maintain control, and this method quite rightly challenges this. How would you recommend we encourage social workers and students to overcome these barriers? Yeah, so I don't have an easy answer to this, but I do know that for all sorts of reasons, it can seem simpler to go to a family and say, well, this is the child in need or the child protection plan. These are the things you have to do. You know, have you done them? I've done this. I think a more collaborative way of working is much more likely to work. It does mean that we have to share power with families. But the reality is, if you want to create a change for families and for children, you have to share power with them. And so I think the idea of a purposeful dialogue provides a framework for thinking about how we share power. And part of that is this higher level thinking about what are the limits to that? You know, so if they say domestic abuse isn't an issue, how do I have a conversation where I say, well, you know, I respect your view. I kind of tried to show I understand your point of view, but I have to also give my view. So how can we have that more complicated sharing of power where we're honest about things? Would you consider there to be any barriers to the effect, Charmaine asks, would you consider there to be any barriers to the effectiveness of MI, and would there be any circumstances that it would not be considered a suitable approach? I mean, I think there are, so I don't know if there are any barriers to the principles of respectful collaborative working. There are two sort of sets of limitations I'm kind of aware of. One is sort of what we talked about, which is we want to be collaborative, but sometimes we need to draw lines or make clear what is non-negotiable or what our point of view is and how we differ, which is sort of what we talked about. But in relation to your issue, I think there are some groups where many of the techniques wouldn't be useful. So an obvious example is younger children, or maybe some people with serious learning difficulty, or someone who's actively psychotic. In fact, MI has been used for some of these groups, but you need to take the principles and adapt to the practices. So you're still trying to be collaborative, you're still trying to be respectful, you're still trying to show people you understand their point of view, but you're perhaps not using open questions and reflections, because with a 5-year-old child, lots of open questions and reflections can just leave them feeling like, I don't know what's happening. You might be better off drawing a picture with them and getting them to show you what they feel like that, and then doing a running commentary of that. And I'm quite interested in exploring that further. Could we take the principles of MI and then apply them with groups or settings or situations where we haven't been able to apply them so far? Is that all the questions answered? Bish bash bosh.
It is. I had one question, which was you were talking about at the beginning you touched, and I think absolutely correctly, you were talking about sometimes that we deal with we learn about these models, and actually you can't really learn the full techniques within a few hours or even a day's training session. And often in local authorities, that is what is offered in terms of using this. So what sort of advice would you give to social workers in practice about how they might develop these sorts of skills, and what sort of things you think people could do without obviously having to go and do a motivational interviewing course, which is going to take them quite a long time and probably come at some expense?
Though they could buy my book, but then moving on from that. No.
And I put your book in the and it's very good. It must be said, I would recommend buying the book. It's very good.
Great, thank you. I'm glad you found it helpful. But more seriously, well, there's a couple of sort of things I wanted to say. One is the people who invented motivational interviewing, Bill Miller and Steve Rolnick. Obviously, they didn't have a book, they didn't have a training course. They developed their skills by learning to listen very carefully to the way people were responding to them. And at the end of they got rid of this in the latest version of the book they have about MI, but in one of the earlier editions, they ended up by saying, what we realized is that resistance was a bit like a red light, and what they call change talk was like a green light. And that if you realize that, the people you're working with are constantly giving you feedback of red lights or green lights. And for me, that was profoundly important, that the way we learn is, in fact, the way not to learn is to go to a 2-day workshop and think that will change your practice. It's if you can take something from today, something from something else you've done, and then think in your interviews with people, in the moment, and also reflecting back on it, what worked, what didn't, what could I try differently? Why did that blow up in my face? Could I have done something differently? Should I have raised the issue differently? Why did that go so well? Why did we really get into that conversation? Was it because whatever? So the people we're working with are constantly giving us feedback about how we're doing. And I think almost the danger is if we think on a social work course or on a workshop or something that we learn our practice, we can learn really important things there. But the people who teach us how to be good social workers are the people we work with day in, day out. And I think that's the most important thing. I'll leave the other.
Yeah. And I think that speaks as well, doesn't it, to actually the importance of that time talking with colleagues and some of those spaces that we perhaps don't think of as developmental, and perhaps actually with everyone's registration coming up, actually re-registration with Social Work England coming up, we perhaps should think about those discussions that we have when we get back to the office, those discussions in team meetings, as part of our continuing development and getting feedback and getting feedback within from people we work with, and then talking about them in supervision within team meetings and within the office, really, to get
really good suggestions. You're right, because these days supervision can often be so kind of, have you done this, have you done that, have you written it all down, that there's not that time for reflecting about why did I do that, why did that interview go so well, and talking, having a cup of tea when you get back to the office, when we go back to the office, or also when you can do a joint visit, it's brilliant to see how other people practice, and also to be willing to ask questions about what they thought of your practice and how you handle things. So that's a great opportunity for learning, particularly if you're a new worker or a student. I know it can be really stressful having your practice observed, but honestly, it's you wouldn't expect your piano teacher to help you learn the piano if they couldn't watch you play. If you just went and said, well, I played really well yesterday. It's someone who has been there and done that, who can watch what you're doing and say, well, try this or try that. So that observation of practice and feedback on practice is also really, really important.
That's excellent. So that we're nearly approaching, we're 3 minutes off the end of the webinar. So Donald, thank you very much for coming. It really is very much appreciated, and I think it was excellent. There's some really positive comments in the chat, and I think that I say I've got a copy of the book, and I've read the book, and well, I've not quite finished all of it, but I've read big chunks of it, and I do think it's very helpful, and I think it's written very much in the way that you've presented today, which is about really talking through the sort of the reality of practice, and I think effectively bridges that sort of the bit that often social work textbooks don't do, which is the bit which is about telling you how the difficult bits work, not just telling you how it works when you encounter the problems, which I think is often missing.
Yeah, I'm really glad, because that's what we were trying to aim to do. Because as a child protection social worker, I was a bit like, well, my textbooks are how to be lovely to people, and I want to be lovely to people, but how do I do it while also pointing out the sort of Esme situation, having that sort of conversation? So I'm really glad you found that helpful.
No, that's fantastic. If I can just very quickly to everyone say that I put a link in the chat where people can sign up to a list so that you get information about future webinars. This webinar is slightly out of sync with the series, but actually, so there is another webinar next week. They're normally fortnightly. I will release the details of that this afternoon, and that's the next two webinars are for Black History Month. So next week we've got a woman called Christine Louis de Sully, who is a French woman who has she's worked in biology in biological research for 20 years, but has recently just done a second PhD in identity, race identity and social justice, and she's going to be talking about making a case for approaching race and social justice and identity from a more universalist point of view. She from the position that was at one point quite popular, and that is the point of sort of Martin Luther King's the position that he made in his I Have a Dream speech. So it'd be really interesting to speak to Christine Louis de Sully next week about that, and then the fortnight after that we've got a academic from Nottingham Trent University coming to talk about working with and supporting Black Sub-Saharan African communities to access support around HIV and AIDS. So this is, I think, I will put those things up, but if you want to sign up, then please, I shall Lucy's just asked that I put the link again, and I will do that. But thank you very much, everyone, for coming today. your attendance is much appreciated. And again, thank you, Donald, for doing this. It's been excellent. Thank you very much.
Thank you for inviting me. Thanks, everyone. Hope to meet you in person sometime.